want to do this? Okay.
All right. All right. This is going to be a conversation on the BDS movement. I'm Ned Ryan. I am the founder of American Majority. I'm also a board member of the American Conservative Union that puts on this great event of CPAC every year. One of the things that I've become very passionate about has been for people to understand what is the BDS movement. When did it begin? What is it doing? What are its goals? What are its aims? For you to become more aware of that so that when you go home, you can understand what's actually taking place on a lot of campuses that are in your area. So I want to introduce all of our panelists a little bit more with quick bios. Then I want to talk a little bit more about defining the BDS movement. We'll have a few quick opening statements, and then we'll have a few questions and back and forth and some dialogue. Sander Gerber is the CEO of Hudson Bay Capital and a fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, was formerly a national board member of APAC and the vice chairman of the Wilson Center. Ariel Davidson is an economic research assistant at the Hoover Institution in Palo Alto. She completed a BA in Russian in Middlebury College with a specific focus on Eastern European politics. She's researched and written extensively on the geopolitical implications of radical Islamic terrorism in Putin's Russia. She has also contributed to both the Federalist and Town Hall. Lisa Taftari is an award-winning investigative journalist, political analyst, and commentator. She's the founding editor of The Foreign Desk, a newswire service covering stories from around the globe with an emphasis on their impact on U.S. foreign policy. So what is the BDS movement? BDS stands for Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, aimed at the State of Israel. It is something that began about 2005 with a collection of Palestinian NGOs with the goal of going out and really truly waging a political, economic, cultural, and ideological campaign to delegitimize the State of Israel. What's been interesting to see is a lot of people, especially in the United States, are not as fully aware of what's taking place with the BDS movement because it really has been focused more on our campuses. It has been basically in the academic centers where the BDS movement has really gained a foothold in the United States. So many people are not aware of it, but don't be deceived. It is a global movement across the world that is really being aimed at delegitimizing the State of Israel. And so I'm hoping that as we talk through this a little bit, you'll get a better understanding of what it is, the motivations behind it, where it stands right now, and then what we can do when we go home to really combat the BDS movement. So, Sander, if you could give a few quick comments on that, and we'll just move down the line, keep it quick, and then I'll start asking some questions.
Sure, thanks. It's a pleasure to be out here again. As I mentioned before, the Palestinian Authority has a payment program to reward and incentivize terror. This is the other side of the coin. BDS is their political warfare against the State of Israel. BDS really should stand for bigotry, dishonesty, and slander. Bigotry is the anti-Semitism. The dishonesty is from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. It's about getting rid of all of Israel. And the slander is that it's about delegitimizing the very State of Israel. These are all conditions that cannot be and do not lead to peace. In fact, if anything, they put the Palestinians further down.
Great. So I just want to kind of touch on what Ned was saying as well and what Sander was saying. So it really is a misinformation campaign, a disinformation campaign, if you will. It basically propagates all sorts of anti-Semitic tropes in order to push this sort of delegitimization, the denigration of the State of Israel. I really think it's important, though, to touch upon the idea that it's specifically, at least in the United States, it's gained the most traction in academia, and that's because it's touching upon the most intellectually vulnerable portions of our population. You have youth that are there in order to learn. And if we have this sort of anti-Israel information just sort of seeping into academia, no one's really regulating it or filtering it in any sort of meaningful way, we could have problems down the road. I mean, in 2006, only 9% of millennials sympathize with Palestinians. Now that ratio is about 27%. So we've seen a threefold increase in the number of millennials who are sympathizing with the Palestinian cause over the Israeli cause. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the BDS movement really took off in 2005. So what they've managed to accomplish, at least in the young American psyche, is pretty remarkable. And the fact that this is going on and older generations just don't have the access to it and wouldn't necessarily, that's an issue. So I'm happy that we're going to be here talking about that.
Lisa.
Picture a 13-year-old girl soaked in her own blood. This horrific picture would be perfect for the cover of the New York Times had she been a Syrian, but she is an Israeli. And the truth is that there's always been a double standard when it comes to Israel, and BDS is no different. Make no mistake, BDS is not to take Israel out of business. It's meant to take Israel off the map. And that is the dishonest propaganda that has really fueled the BDS movement, whether it's from the campus or to union workers or to the emotional plea made to everyday Americans to follow this movement. Now, the challenge with combating BDS is that it's enshrouded in this effort to protect human rights. Human rights. The same people who support suicide bombings, where these young children or people who are at a pizza shop or on a local bus are being blown up, people who support this kind of violence are now worried about human rights. When you see somebody who's supporting the BDS movement, ask them, what was the last thing you did for the Palestinian people? Or what was the last thing that the Palestinian authorities or Hamas, who's now in charge, did for the Palestinian people? And the truth is, I cover this day in and day out. I can tell you what Israel has done for the Palestinian people, what Israel has done for its Christians, for its Muslims, for its Druze, and for its Bedouin populations. And those are the facts. Those are the facts that are missing from the mainstream media. And the truth is that until this is uncovered and we can become the ambassadors of this type of information, the emotional plea that the BDS movement makes will carry that propaganda.
Thank you. So I want to ask some questions, and I'll aim the questions at one of you, but I hope that all of us will join into that conversation. Sandra, I want to ask, I am growing more and more concerned. We've been seeing this in the news, rise of some anti-Semitic behavior here in the United States, which is troubling. It's sad to see. Do you think that the BDS movement is normalizing anti-Semitic behavior?
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned at first, the B stands for bigotry. And I recently took a daughter on a tour of Columbia University. And in the middle of campus, there's two protests. On the north side was the Arabs protesting against Israel, and on the south side was the Jews protesting against Israel. And at the end of the tour, and it was nonchalant, tour guide didn't mention anything. At the end of the tour, we were on the tour for an hour, I said to her, what were those people protesting about? She said, oh, it's Israel Apartheid Week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, and very nonchalant things. So now, throughout the rest of this young tour guide's life, after she graduates Columbia, she's got to think, we always had Israel Apartheid Week.
Right.
Right? And so they're defining it in that way. And so BDS is very insidious, particularly on the college campuses, because that's when people are impressionable, and that's when they will form the opinions that will carry them for the rest of their lives. Even though she didn't participate in the protest, even though she didn't really know the details, all she knew was it's Israel Apartheid Week.
No, and that's what concerns me, is that these young people, 18, 19, 20, who are going to be our leaders in the future, 10, 15 years from now, are going to have these thoughts, are going to have this in their mindset that, you know, Israel Apartheid Week, that Israel is the equivalent of South Africa. And I think it's a very dangerous mentality to let fester on our college campuses. But Ariel, you've got some other thoughts too on what's been taking place on the campuses.
Absolutely. So I think it's been a really focused campaign in order to make sure that this sort of propaganda is disseminated, and disseminated in such a way as to sort of avoid the public eye. I think that a lot of times you'll run into certain pro-BDS professors, and they might not be professedly pro-BDS, but what they'll do is they'll incorporate into their curriculum. They will invite certain anti-Israel activists onto campus. They'll make sure that students are required as part of their course to attend one of these seminars or all of these seminars. A lot of times they'll form advocacy groups specifically for BDS professors. I believe there's one out of California called the California Scholars for Freedom. Don't be fooled by the name. It's really just a collection of pro-BDS professors that kind of have joined rank and file in order to protect one another. And so when they do use their university server to put a BDS resource page up, they have the proper protections in place. And what's most frightening about this is that these are taxpayer dollars. You're talking about UC Berkeley, which is one of the institutions, one of the 6 institutions that student government associations passed a resolution in, I think, 2013 to 2014. Either 2012 or 2013, they passed a resolution basically saying we support the boycott, divestment of Israel movement. And it's fortunately you have the higher ups at academic institutions saying, no, we're not going to act upon this resolution. But that doesn't mean it's not being successful. That doesn't mean that it's not being, this ideology is not being disseminated among the population, even if the university isn't responding to it. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
So Lisa, we know that a lot of these movements don't just happen, that this activity doesn't just all of a sudden crop up. We know that it's being funded somewhere by someone. Where is the money coming to fund the BDS movement? Who's doing that? Who's funding it?
Yeah, there's a long list of whether they're supporters or funders, sponsors. And when you go to the website and you look at this long list.
And where can people go? Where's the website that they can go to really look at these lists and these names of people who are?
If you just Google BDS Movement official site, you'll come across a long list of supporters domestically, within Europe, abroad. And it's become the kosher form of terrorism, I should say halal form of terrorism.
Right.
It's become a way for those who are aware of what this is doing to support another form of terrorism. And I bet you many of them don't know that they're supporting this kind of terrorism. So it's a very dishonest, it's a dishonest movement. And I think what it truly comes down to is that, well, here's the good news. I don't want this to be all bad news today.
Right.
The good news is that the BDS movement as an economic movement is completely failing.
Yes,
it is completely failing. But you fight divestment with divestment. You fight boycotts with boycotts. You can talk about the Ivanka Trump, for example, boycott and pulling her stuff off the shelves, but then go to Amazon. She's a #1 seller in a lot of categories. So you fight dollar to dollar, whether you're pro or you're anti. But what's happening is that propaganda, that ideology is still being spread. And they're going after minds and hearts that are up for grabs. And they do this, whether it's the unions, whether it's the college campus, it's the mob mentality that they're after. They're not after the informed individuals, they're after the low-informed individuals.
No, exactly, and that's why I was so excited to be able to do this panel for people, for you all to understand and get a better grasp, at least for 30 minutes, about what the BDS movement is about, what it's doing, where it has really gained traction on our campuses. The thing that is of some concern is, again, it's normalizing certain behavior, certain rhetoric, certain approaches towards the state of Israel, but also towards the Jewish population. So the thing that is really becoming apparent to me is that when these things start to crop up, you have to immediately address them, whether it's the alt-right movement, whether it's the BDS movement. In my mind, they are anti-Semitism by another name. And so the thing that is of concern is these things start slowly because people don't fully understand what they're about. I have seen some languages, some verbiage in student newspapers about people promoting the BDS movement that has been very aggressive, hateful speech. But it starts slowly, people don't understand it. Do we see any correlation between some of this stuff that's taking place and starting to gain root between the 1930s, Germany, and here? And that does, trust me when I say, when you will have seen some of this language, that's not too far of a stretch to say, hateful, we should put these people into ovens, we cannot have progress with the parasitic Jew. These are things that are being written in student newspapers across our campuses. And so it's something that you realize it starts slowly, people don't understand, there's ignorance about it. But Sandra, what would be your take on this? And I know, Ariel, I think you've got some thoughts on this as well.
Well, it's a sad state of affairs because exactly as you said, if you don't stop it, it's going to spread. Right. And even though people might not believe the Nazi caricatures of Israeli leaders, they say, well, they're still bad people. And that's part of the slander to delegitimize the state of Israel and say that they just simply don't deserve to exist. So I think very much so, being anti-Israel is the new anti-Semitism. And
Couldn't agree
these
more.
two go hand in hand, and this is not something new. In '05, I went over, Bush sent me to this conference on anti-Semitism in Cordoba, Spain, and we were dealing with that issue there, but now it's grown, and with the BDS movement, you can really see the impact of it, where I think anti-Semitism is much more in vogue, particularly on the college campuses.
Right, Ariel, I know
And
you had a few thoughts on this.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think what's interesting about the idea of the academic boycott is really not allowing Jewish professors with Israeli citizenship to come over into universities, American universities, to participate in conferences, to publish research or collaborate with American professors. And if you put that visual, this is what their goal is, at least. These are what the boycott movement is hoping for. If you juxtapose that next to the image of 1930s Germany, where Nazi officials were literally pushing out Jewish professors out of German universities, that's not a coincidence that that's the same sort of intellectual suppression taking place. And so the BDS movement in general is just a way of, again, what Nazis had hoped to do as well, which is economically, socially, politically, culturally isolate the Jews. And I think you have both touched on already the idea of how anti-Semitism can definitely be cloaked or protected by this anti-Zionist movement. Now, does that mean everybody in this movement is anti-Semitic? No. I think because it's so much disinformation being spread, it would be very disingenuous to say, oh, everyone is anti-Semitic who's taking part in BDS. But do I think there's a lack of knowledge and ignorance associated with this movement? And do I think that maybe, or not maybe, very much so, the people in the higher ups leading this push, especially from the Palestinian side? Yes, I definitely think it's driven by anti-Semitism.
Lisa, feel free to jump in. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think you can compare apples to apples and say that there was actually a boycott of Jewish businesses in Nazi Germany, and that's how it began. But that is the operative term, is that that's where it began. It was a movement to go further and further and further, and that's exactly what's being done here, is that it's being enshrouded in this movement of we just don't want their products. But it goes much further beyond that. And unfortunately, the media is complicit in all of this. I was just in Syria a few months ago, and I go to the Middle East very often, but this was my first time visiting, hospitals on the borders and refugee camps. And the most amazing story that I've ever done in my life was going to this hospital on the Israeli side and seeing where Israel was actually treating Syrians, not just from the war, but cancer patients and children and high complication labor cases, and they don't need to do that. This is an enemy state. And I interviewed someone from the Free Syrian Army, and I said to him, what did you think about Jews or Israel before you got here? He said, I thought they had horns and tails. I said, well, what do you think now that they saved your life? This guy got shot in the knee by an ISIS sniper. There was a hole this big in his leg. And he said, I still think they have horns and tails. So this is what Israel's doing. No one's reporting on what they're doing, how they're helping, how they send aid to Darfur and to Haiti. And all the work that Israel's doing is being completely ignored by the media, but the BDS movement gets a front row seat, unfortunately.
No, and it's, as you start to normalize, and this is what I'm concerned about, that it normalizes, again, this behavior, this rhetoric, and it's something that we have to be very aware of. The good news is, as you made that point, Lisa, it's not being terribly successful in its stated goals of really, undermining and delegitimizing the state of Israel. And the good news is, I believe it's now 25 state legislatures have passed anti-BDS language. It's somewhere in that ballpark. My hope is, and that I would hope to be a part of it, that we'll get to all 50 states to pass anti-BDS language. And I hope that it happens soon. Again, as I said earlier, you can't allow these things to fester. You have to deal with them. You have to be aggressive with them and say, no, we will not tolerate this. And so as everyone is sitting here and those that are watching, we're here at CPAC for a couple more days. Hopefully you're going to even have even greater panels and President Trump's coming tomorrow, but you're going to be going home. And when everybody is going to go home, I always like to make sure that you're going to hear great ideas, you're going to hear great information, but ideas and information that's not linked to action doesn't actually bring about meaningful change. And so it's my hope that whatever you hear from the stage at CPAC, you'll be given some action items to be able to take home. And so the question that I want to ask you three is, When people go home from CPAC, in your mind, give me some of the best action items that they can take home with them to make sure that they are educating and combating the BDS movement in their local communities. So Sandra, if we could start from you and then just come this way.
Well, I'm going to give a little different tack than our other two esteemed panelists. I think that we have to go on the offensive against BDS, that in order to really change hearts and minds, the people who are predisposed have to be willing to listen. And sometimes it's hard to get people willing to listen to facts.
Right.
So I think what we need to do is to educate that the Palestinian Authority has been sponsoring terror through paying the terrorists, but also through political warfare, aka the BDS movement, that these are two sides of the tactic that they're using. And I think that if we expose who the Palestinian Authority really is, I think it will change the view of Israel with that regard.
Great. Ariel.
I agree with Sandra completely. I will say too, I think there's this misconception that Hamas is much worse than the PA, but I think they're equally terrible. And so I think that there should be a much, one is just more flagrant about it. But I really do believe that we need to be better about making sure that the truth is known, whether it be on college campuses and outside college campuses. I also want to say, follow the money too. Go on to NGO Monitor, figure out which charities are actually charitable and which ones are donating to pro-Palestinian causes. Human Rights Watch, they were a huge supporter of the Caterpillar boycott, which I'm not sure, I won't get into too much detail, but I will say this, that there are several NGOs out there they're called Halo NGOs because they're given a little bit of this esteemed sort of humanitarian aura, but there are several NGOs out there that you wouldn't even suspect are at all tied to pro-Palestinian causes and sort of spreading this sort of BDS propaganda, but they are. So be vigilant about that, and be vigilant as taxpayers. Figure out what's going on your local college campus, if it is a state system.
Lisa.
I think it's pretty simple. The next time you see someone who supports BDS, you say to them, do you use Waze? Do you use Google Chrome? Do you use Facebook?
That's right.
Are you willing to get off these platforms? Are you willing to never walk into a hospital or use a cell phone again? I dare you to truly boycott, divest, and sanction Israeli products. And the truth of the matter is 75% of Israel's industrial exports are technology. So you can't just say, I'm not going to buy hummus and say that I'm really following the BDS movement. And really talk about the accomplishments and the dedication that Israel has to its neighbors in the Arab world, how it compares to its neighbors on human rights, on women's rights, on gay rights. It is a Jewish state, and there is an annual gay pride parade in Jerusalem, its holiest city. These are the facts that are being totally buried under everything else. And you say to someone, I dare you, I truly dare you to stay away from Israeli products and put down your cell phone.
We've got less than a minute. I would encourage all of you, when you go home, to at least pick up the phone, call your state legislator and say, I just want you to be aware, if you've not already addressed the BDS movement, that you would be willing to put forth language in the state legislature that would be anti-BDS language and help educate your elected officials, and not just at the state legislature, but even your local officials. There's been some interesting things that have been taking place with city councils and county commissions. Make sure that you are out there educating your elected officials on this and saying, if you haven't already passed anti-BDS language, I would hope that you would in the very near future. What's encouraging to me that's taking place right now is that our president has shown that he will stand with Israel. He has taken a strong stand with him. I am encouraged by that. They are our best ally in the Middle East. And so it remains up to us too as well. It's up to us as well, as Trump has taken a strong stance, that you also take a stance and say, we want to protect and we want to support our best ally in the Middle East. And what you can do when you go home is make sure that your elected officials are aware of this BDS movement that is attempting to undercut and delegitimize the state of Israel. We are out of time. I want to thank all of the panelists for being here. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you will take this information home and apply it. Thank you very much.